The most dangerous moment in global politics is not when a superpower is shouting, it's when it goes quiet. What I'm about to share with you didn't come from a speech, a leak, or a breaking news alert. It comes from a pattern, one that intelligence agencies are trained to fear. Right now, inside Washington's situation rooms, something unusual is happening. Not panic, not urgency, silence. Russia has stopped doing what the West expected. No dramatic threats, no constant nuclear signaling, no emotional escalation. And that is precisely why alarm bells are ringing. Because noise is predictable. Silence means calculation. When a pressured power becomes disciplined, restrained, almost calm, it usually means one thing. The strategy has changed. If you're still watching this conflict only through battlefield maps and daily headlines, you're already behind. Stay with me, because what's unfolding now isn't about Ukraine alone. It's about a deeper shift that will shape global power for years. And to see it clearly, we must first confront the mistake Washington believes it is fixing. To understand what is really happening, we need to step back from the noise of public debate and ask a harder question. What problem does Washington believe it is solving right now? From the American perspective, the logic appears simple. Apply pressure. Sustain sanctions. Arm Ukraine. Wait for Russia to exhaust itself. This framework assumes that Russia remains in a reactive posture, responding, absorbing, improvising. It assumes time works against Moscow. But that assumption is now under strain. Inside the intelligence community, there is growing discomfort that the United States may be solving the wrong equation, because pressure does not produce collapse automatically. In history, sustained pressure often produces adaptation, and adaptation changes incentives. What Washington sees as containment, Moscow increasingly interprets as a long-term structural challenge to its security, economy, and status. When states reach that conclusion, they stop asking how to win the next move. They start asking how to reshape the board itself. This is where misalignment begins. One side is managing a crisis. The other is preparing for an era. To understand how we arrived at this divergence, we need to look at where this confrontation actually began and how its logic evolved over time. To understand the present, we have to revisit the origin of this conflict, not the latest battles, but the cycle that shaped behavior on both sides. For years, this confrontation followed a familiar rhythm. The West applied pressure, Russia reacted, sanctions were announced, countermeasures followed, weapons flowed in, threats flowed out. It was a feedback loop, visible, noisy, and measurable. In that phase, Russia behaved like a state trying to absorb shocks while signaling resolve. Its responses were blunt. They were designed for deterrence, not transformation. But history tells us something important. States do not remain reactive forever. When pressure becomes permanent rather than temporary, strategy evolves. At some point, leaders stop asking, how do we respond to this? They ask, how do we make this pressure irrelevant? That moment appears to have arrived. What changed was not ideology. It was time horizon. As this conflict dragged on, Moscow increasingly treated it not as a crisis to survive, but as a condition to adapt to. And when that mental shift occurs, policy stops being episodic. It becomes structural. To see what that shift looks like in practice, we need to examine the first visible rupture, the moment analysts realized the old playbook no longer applied. The first rupture didn't arrive with explosions or emergency summits. It arrived quietly, and that's why it was so unsettling. Analysts began to notice something subtle. Russian behavior no longer followed the familiar rhythm of action and reaction. Moves were fewer, statements were shorter, signals were restrained. At first, this looked like exhaustion. But intelligence professionals are trained to distrust comforting explanations because exhaustion produces disorder. What they were seeing instead was discipline. Military exercises continued, but with less spectacle. Strategic messaging cooled in tone, yet sharpened in precision. Nuclear rhetoric faded, not disappeared, but receded into the background. This was not de-escalation. It was reallocation. The realization slowly took hold that Russia was no longer trying to shock Western publics or force immediate concessions. They had concluded something critical. Dramatic escalation unified the alliance. Quiet repositioning did not. That insight changes everything. This moment matters because it marks the transition from crisis behavior to preparation behavior, from signaling resolve to building leverage. If you want to understand why this phase is more dangerous than open confrontation, stay with me. Because what looks calm on the surface often hides the most consequential shifts underneath. And to uncover those shifts, we need to look at the mechanisms most people never see. When power shifts quietly, it does so through mechanisms, not moments. And this is where most public discussion fails. The core mechanism at work here is leverage. Not battlefield leverage alone, but systemic leverage. Russia appears to have concluded that matching the West move for move was a losing proposition. So instead of responding symmetrically, it began investing asymmetrically. Think about what that means. Instead of asking how to counter the next weapons package, Moscow started asking how to reduce the relevance of Western pressure altogether. This is why we see emphasis on permanence rather than speed. Forced deployments designed to endure industrial mobilization calibrated for years, not months. Economic adjustments meant to survive isolation rather than reverse it. These are not tactical choices. They are structural ones. What worries intelligence analysts is not any single action. It's the coherence across domains. Military, economic, political, all moving in the same direction. This is how shaping strategies work. They don't seek immediate victories. They seek to alter the cost structure of the entire system. Over time, they force opponents into a dilemma. Respond everywhere and exhaust yourself, or respond selectively and concede ground. And once that dilemma sets in, every decision becomes more expensive than the last. To see how this plays out under pressure, we need to examine the second escalation point, the one unfolding in slow motion. The second escalation is not an event you can point to on a calendar. It's a condition, and that makes it harder to confront. What intelligence agencies are watching now is a compression of pressure across multiple arenas, not a spike, a squeeze. Russia is no longer concentrating its leverage in one theater. Instead, it is distributing stress. Energy markets adjust slowly. Industrial capacity locks in quietly. Security relationships deepen outside Europe, beyond Washington's immediate reach. None of this triggers emergency meetings on its own. Together, they alter the strategic baseline. This is where the tempo becomes dangerous, because the United States is built to respond to crises. It is not built to respond to accumulation. Bureaucracies debate. Allies diverge. Political attention fragments. Meanwhile, the system keeps shifting. What looks like restraint is actually pressure applied below the threshold of reaction. Each move is defensible in isolation. Each one is ambiguous. But the combined effect is cumulative, and cumulative effects are hard to reverse. This is the second crisis, not escalation through action, but escalation through endurance. A test of who can adapt faster, wait longer, and absorb more friction without breaking. And when strategy turns into a test of endurance, the true costs are no longer abstract. They land on people. That's where we need to go next. This is where the strategy stops being theoretical and starts affecting you. When great powers reshape systems, the costs rarely arrive all at once. They show up quietly, in daily life, in prices that creep upward, in uncertainty that never quite goes away. If you live in Europe, energy is no longer just an economic variable. It's a political one. If you live elsewhere, inflation, supply disruptions, and market volatility are no longer temporary shocks. They are becoming a condition. And here's the hardest truth. No one feels responsible for these costs, yet everyone absorbs them. Governments debate strategy, Institutions debate doctrine, but you deal with the consequences. You're told this is about deterrence or stability or values. But what you experience is friction, more expensive choices, less margin for error. This is how endurance strategies work. They don't seek dramatic pain. They seek persistent discomfort. And that discomfort creates political pressure inside democracies first. Elections arrive faster than strategic payoffs. Patience wears thin. If you felt that quiet fatigue, you're not imagining it. That fatigue is part of the battlefield. If you want clarity instead of noise, stay engaged. Understanding the structure is the first defense, because what you feel locally is now reshaping power globally. What you are experiencing is not isolated. It is connected across borders, markets, and alliances. When pressure shifts from the battlefield to the system, the effects travel outward. Energy realignments change trade flows. Financial adjustments weaken old assumptions. Security partnerships form outside traditional alliances. This is where the global picture becomes unstable. The West assumed isolation would constrain Russia. Instead, it accelerated diversification. New buyers, new payment channels, new political relationships. None of this replaces Western markets overnight, but it reduces dependency, and reduced dependency weakens leverage. At the same time, alliances face uneven exposure. Some countries feel energy strain more acutely. Others feel security risk more directly. Threat perception fragments. That fragmentation matters. Deterrence relies on shared risk and shared response. But when pressure lands unevenly, unity becomes fragile. From a strategic standpoint, this is the objective. Not to defeat the alliance militarily, but to stretch it politically. The more global the system becomes, the harder it is to coordinate action. And the harder coordination becomes, the slower responses get. This is how gray zone competition expands. Quietly, incrementally, across the seams of the international order. To understand where this leads, we need to look ahead, not at one future, but several. When systems shift, the future never arrives in a single form. It branch. The first path is the optimistic one. Pressure stabilizes. Adaptation slows. A new equilibrium emerges, tense, but managed. Competition remains contained, and escalation is avoided through restraint and recalibration on both sides. The second path is more likely. Prolonged friction becomes normal. No collapse, no resolution. Just constant adjustment, rising costs, and strategic fatigue. Democracies struggle to sustain focus, while endurance favors those who can wait. Then there is the third path, the dangerous one. Incremental moves accumulate until a line is crossed without anyone intending to cross it. A cyber incident misread. An energy shock politicized. A military posture interpreted as preparation. In this scenario, escalation doesn't feel reckless. It feels justified, and that is precisely the risk. From a systems perspective, the danger is not aggression. It's misalignment. Each side believes it is acting defensively. Each side believes time favors restraint. History suggests otherwise. When warning signals grow quiet, not loud, institutions respond too late. By the time consequences are visible, options have narrowed. Which path prevails depends less on intentions than on structure. On whether leaders recognize endurance strategies for what they are and adapt before momentum locks in. And that brings us to the final question. What, if anything, can still be done? The most dangerous illusion in global politics is believing that nothing urgent is happening because nothing explosive is visible. What intelligence professionals are confronting now is not a countdown to war. It is something harder to stop, a gradual narrowing of choices. Endurance strategies don't announce themselves. They work by the time you notice them. The costs of reversal are already high. And democracies, by design, struggle with that kind of threat. This is not about blaming one side or celebrating the other. It's about recognizing structure. When power competition shifts from shock to shaping, the advantage goes to those who understand systems, patience, and timing. The real risk is complacency. Public attention stays glued to headlines, while deeper shifts unfold beneath them. By the time the consequences feel undeniable, leaders discover they are reacting to a landscape they no longer control. From a realist perspective, this is how consequential change actually happens. Quietly, incrementally, and then all at once. If this analysis helped you see beyond the noise, don't stop here. Follow the structure, not the spectacle. Share this with someone who still thinks the danger only arrives with sirens. Because the future of global power won't be decided by the loudest moment, but by the longest one. And this story is far from over.